As we continue our study in the Gospel of John, let's think now about the year of writing. When was the Gospel of John written? When did the Apostle John write the fourth Gospel? We just don't know with certainty. Many suggest 95 AD, but they really don't offer a lot of compelling evidence for that. There is one little piece of evidence that's interesting to consider. In the Gospel, fourth Gospel, chapter 5, verse 2, it says, "There is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades." The text very clearly says, there is, not there was. Well, it's the present tense in Greek. Well, in the year 70 AD, the Roman general Titus destroyed the temple and almost all of Jerusalem. 70 AD. There's a famous author, Josephus, that in his book, The Jewish Wars, book 7, chapter 1, verse 1, Josephus says that 2 towers and part of the west wall were left standing. But Josephus tells us that aside from that, General Titus destroyed the whole city. That strongly suggests that this pool near the sheep gate, which in Aramaic was called Bethesda, which is, John says, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades, was destroyed in 70 AD. 70 AD was a shocking, painful, tragic, catastrophic year for all Jews. John just couldn't have written, "There is such and such a place in Jerusalem." He couldn't have written that after 70 AD, after the horrific, catastrophic destruction of almost everything except part of the west wall and 2 towers of the wall. So that's very strong evidence that the Gospel of John was written before 70 AD. Besides that, that's the strongest indication that we have. But other than that, how early? Well, scholars like to argue about which gospel was written first and second and third and fourth. Those are very complicated arguments. But it is pretty strikingly clear that the Gospel of John must have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. There is a scrap of an ancient manuscript that was found in Egypt, preserved. This scrap of ancient manuscript was preserved in Egypt because of the dry weather there. It's called Papyrus 52. It does contain several verses from chapter 18. Because of the style of the handwriting, some scholars date the writing of that particular copy of John's Gospel at 130 AD. Other scholars say, 170 AD. Well, how many years did it take from John originally writing the original copy of the Gospel of John till that copy was made and then many years later discovered in Egypt? We just don't know. But because those scholars date that scrap of papyrus no later than 170 AD, that is proof that the assertion of some scholars that, the Gospel of John was written by a committee of Christians in the year 200, that's proven to be false by the existence of that scrap of paper. We know that the Lord Jesus died in either 30 or 33 AD. So, and it looks like John was a young man at that time. Why do we say John was a young man? Well, he outran Peter to the tomb. So it's possible that John was young at 30 AD. Before 70 is a good guess about the date of the Gospel of John. But let's just be clear. There's not a lot of certainty about this. Most likely before 70 AD. So we think that it was less than 40 years after the Lord's death that John, now an older man, wrote the Gospel of John. Let's continue and consider the purpose of the Gospel of John. What was John's overriding purpose in writing the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel? Well, we want to look at John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31 for the answer to that. Let me read that. So on the one hand, Jesus also did many other signs before his disciples, which have not been written in this book. But on the other hand, these have been written so that, that's purpose, so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that believing you might have life in his name. So it's very clear from verse 31 that these have been written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So the Gospel of John was written with a strong evangelistic purpose. And that evangelistic purpose is strikingly clear in the Gospel of John, all the way up through to the foot washing event in John chapter 13. But then after that, the focus shifts from evangelism to discipleship. He is training the 11 to be disciples after, in the middle of the foot washing and forward. We'll talk about this later, but there seems to be a discipleship purpose here. Is that possibly what John meant when he said, and so that believing you might have life in his name? It seems like the expression have life is the idea that they might have abundant life. Abundant life. How do you have abundant life? You have abundant life by believing and following the Lord Jesus, being his disciple, a disciple that believes and a disciple that follows, obeys. And so that is what we see from the middle of the foot washing on towards the crucifixion. How are we believers, to be disciples and thus have rich, abundant life in his name? So it does seem like the Gospel of John has two purposes, as recorded in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31 especially. First purpose, evangelism. Second purpose, discipleship. And who was it that John was writing to? Who did he mean to focus on as his original first readers? Well, the casual reader notices in reading the Gospel of John that common Hebrew and Aramaic terms like rabbi and Messiah, and Aramaic words like Cephas and Passover, these were all easily understood by the Jews and needed no translation. But those Aramaic and Hebrew words are explained by John to the Greek readers. Aramaic and Hebrew words, obvious to Jews, are explained so that Gentile readers, Greek readers that don't know Aramaic or Hebrew, will understand them. That suggests that he was including Greek non-Jews in his intended readership. Well, on the other hand, a careful reading of passages like the Lord's teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, chapter 6, verse 25 through 59, and his invitation to thirsty people during the Feast of Booths, that's chapter 7, especially verses 37 and 38, and John's omission of the trial before Caiaphas in chapter 18, this suggests that John especially wrote to Jews because Gentiles, non-Jews, would miss some of the richness of those teachings. There's a close connection between the Lord Jesus and the Jewish feasts, which would only have been understood by those Jews. Well, note also that in 1913, it is a Greek word meaning stone pavement, which is explained by the Aramaic word Gabbatha, rather than, as above, Aramaic words that are explained by Greek words. So the translation clarifications went both ways. John definitely wants to persuade those who are waiting for the hope of Israel, the Messiah, that Jesus will and has already fulfilled that hope. Jesus is the Messiah for whom the Jews had been hoping for many generations. We should remember, though, that although almost all the conversations recorded in the Gospel of John happened in Aramaic, the book was written in Greek, not Aramaic. We, even reading the Greek original of the Gospel of John, are reading a translation from the original spoken words, which were almost all in Aramaic. This was almost certainly because the Lord wanted to use it for evangelism and discipleship in the broader Greek-speaking world rather than the narrow Aramaic-speaking world. It was not enough to leave all those conversations in the original Aramaic. The wider world needed this message and still needs this message. So even the language that the Gospel of John was written in reminds us of the missionary purpose of the Gospel of John. Well, it's best to conclude that John wrote to evangelize and disciple both Jews and Gentiles. And it's simply not clear whether he intended Jews or Gentiles as his primary audience. He wrote in a style and with words that are winsome for both Jews and Gentiles. Gospel of John is a very well-balanced book. It has a strong evangelistic section, which flows easily into a strong discipleship section. It can be read and understood by Jews and non-Jews. So to summarize, date of writing, probably before 70 AD, when the city was almost all catastrophically destroyed. Purpose, evangelism, and discipleship. Evangelism for unbelievers, discipleship for believers. And the recipients, well, Jews and non-Jews, can read the Gospel of John with great joy and understanding.